Good afternoon, participants. We'll be starting in about a minute or so. Welcome to our session. Good afternoon and welcome. I am honored to be here with you today for a session on utilizing the LCFF and LCAP to reach equity for English learners. We know that districts are currently deep in the work of developing their 3-year LCAP, and we at MCAP are very excited to share our tool with you as you design your LCAP with an equity lens for multilingual learners. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, and we're looking forward to an exciting session of learning for the next hour. I'd like to share a little bit about who the MCAP Alliance is. The MCAP Alliance is really a strong force of passionate leaders committed to implementing the English Learner Roadmap policy. The California Association for Bilingual Education, or CABE, is the lead partner for the project with the following strong official partners. We have our partners here with us today at San Diego County offices. We have Orange partners from Butte, San Bernardino, our partners from Fresno, and we also are partnered with San Diego State University in this 3-year grant. Together, this strong alliance is committed during this grant period to meet our grant goals of implementing the English Learner Roadmap policy across the state and work towards creating a multilingual California. Participants, in a few minutes, you'll be hearing from us and who your presenters are today. And I would like to also share that we have a couple of other MCAP leads that will be joining us today or have joined us today. So welcome. But I'd like to take this opportunity now to invite you to introduce yourself using the chat box. Please tell us where you are joining us from and what your role is at the school site, how you're engaged in the development of your LEA's LCAP, and within the context of distance learning. And I know that that may have changed just recently for some of us perhaps, but what is one of those takeaways from our distance learning context that has informed the updating of your LCAP, your 3-year LCAP? So take a quick moment now to share in the chat box, and I'll invite one of my colleagues to please read out a couple of the responses. Take a couple of moments to share out. I will share that I am zooming in from the city of Linwood. I know my colleague Gisela is zooming in from, I believe, San Diego. And then the other presenter for today, Lisa Clark, it's zooming in from Fresno. So where are you zooming in from and where are you joining us from? Please go ahead and share in the chat box.
Dr. Castro, so we have a few people from Delano, a few people from Santa Maria, San Bernardino, Fresno, San Marcos, Northern California, Mendocino County, Orange County, Bakersfield, Watsonville, Oak Grove. Wow, statewide representation.
Wonderful. Welcome, welcome. And it's so exciting to see that statewide representation and the commitment to this work across the state, that we're really looking at our LCAP with that equity lens for multilingual learners. So as we move into our next slide, I'd like to also invite you to please access the resources. In our chat box, we have with us today our MCAP team, Anya and Alexandra, who will be supporting us and providing some of the links for you to access throughout the presentation. So as we get ready, please take a moment now. We invite you to open the resources that are going to be provided for you in the chat and have these available, perhaps on open tabs. And I know our computers are often full of different open tabs as we are working on various projects, but we want to encourage you to have these open so that as we come into those areas in the presentation, you're able to maneuver through these resources. You will have a links document that is made available for you. We also have for you the link to the MCAP that you'll be able to request, and it's immediately sent to you. So you'll want to access the link to the MCAP LCFF tool. And later on in the presentation, we'll also be using the Padlet. So if you'd like to open that resource as well, I encourage you to do so. And as we move into our next slide, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to open your resources. As you are opening your resources, again, we want to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Alma Castro. I am the director of the Multilingual California Project with CABE and as I've shared, our 5 county office partners. In this role as a director of MCAP, I often do find myself putting on a cap as my previous work as a school teacher, as a school administrator, and really reflect on what the LCAP means for the school, for the district, and for all stakeholders, and in implementing practices and programs and supports to really support the students and to support biliteracy and multilingual education for our students as well. As we know, CABE is the leading agency for the MCAP grant, which is an EWIG grant. And through this work, we have strong partnership across the state. And today I'm very fortunate to share this space along 2 of my colleagues who are MCAP leads. And I'll go ahead and hand it over now to Isela Jacobo, who will introduce herself, as well as Lisa Clark.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is Isela from San Diego County Office of Ed. Beautiful San Diego, saying hi, and again, truly appreciate the time that you're making to be with us today. So very quickly, some of my experience includes being a district level and a site level administrator, and under those roles, I obviously recognize the importance of ensuring that we bring that equity lens to all the work we do when it comes to creating, developing, and furthering the systems we have for our English learners. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to Lisa Clark.
Thank you, Isela. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Clark, and I am the ELA/ELD coordinator at the Fresno County Superintendent of Schools office. And you may see me in your district or at your site or your county office doing LPAC training and connecting the LPAC and instructional implications to the LPAC for our English learners and improving education for our English learners. So I'm very happy to be here as well. Alma? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and go right into our next slide here for our learning outcomes for our short session today. So our learning outcomes today really are quite simple. We really want to talk about this tool through the lens of equity and take an equity pause here. The pandemic has certainly presented many challenges for us in these last few months, but really also some opportunities that we might be able to seize upon and to address those English learner needs through our LCAP. We're going to take some time today to consider the use of our MCAP LCFF tool for focusing LEA resources and funding on comprehensively addressing the needs of our ELs in the LCAP. And then finally, we want to influence, educate, and inform others on the importance of applying an equity lens to the development of equitable systems via our LCAP. So it's important to recognize that MCAP is very focused, and one of our goals actually is to help strengthen implementation of the EL roadmap. The EL roadmap was adopted in 2017, and it is state policy in the era of local control. So really what the roadmap is a statement of intent, of commitment and direction intended to guide local planning our use of resources and provision of services and programs. And we want it to be used by all levels of the system to move in the same direction through locally determined pathways. So why do we need an English learner roadmap? Well, first of all, over 1.1 million English learners are enrolled in California schools. 60% of children ages 0 to 5 are dual language learners. And there still remains a significant and persistent achievement gap for our English learners. So really this roadmap was created to align with state and federal standards and new policies, and it provides an assets-oriented approach to learning English. Next slide. So the purposes of the MCAP are several. First of all, MCAP is a 3-year grant, really intended to support our English learners, again, to strengthen our systems with that asset-based approach. We know that a robust body of research supports multilingualism in preparing students for academic excellence and to participate fully in a global context. So guiding the implementation of the California English Learner Roadmap and its 4 principles, the MCAP project will deliver a powerful statewide model of professional learning to strengthen the capacity of districts to then accelerate the academic and multilingual opportunities and outcomes of English learners across California. The English Learner Roadmap has 4 guiding principles, and you'll see those here on the slide, though the writing is quite tiny. But just to highlight the overall principles, and they are assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools. Again, viewing our English learners from an assets-based lens. Our second principle is intellectual quality of instruction and meaningful access. And when we say meaningful access, we mean access for all students. System conditions that support effectiveness. So where are we in terms of our systems, and how does that guide what we do for English learners? And provide that alignment and articulation within and across those systems. And we'll go on to the next slide. So our goals as an MCAP team are many. These are our 5 goals, and as we meet as a team, we keep these goals in mind. So we know, again, that the 4 principles must be integral to all the work that we do, and our 5 goals here that you will see on the slide are to build capacity among school leaders to implement the EL roadmap. So really building that awareness and helping schools see all the resources that are in that roadmap. We're also meant to support implementation of instructional practices, to create a multilingual collaborative statewide network of experts, to identify and emphasize high quality models for professional development, and support the implementation, alignment, and articulation of the EL roadmap across and within our school district systems. Those are our goals of the MCAP, and through the lens of equity today, you'll see the tool that we have created and are excited to present to you from us to you.
So leading with a vision, colleagues. So the work that we have ahead of us definitely requires that we as equity leaders have a clear vision. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and I'm going to have you, we're all going to take a pause, and we're going to take some time to read the quote on this particular slide on leading with a vision. So please take a few moments to read through this important quote. A quote that will help us ground our work for today. So a key question as we engage in the work ahead of us and the work that we've been doing for the last year and a half is, are we willing to use the opportunity that it's ahead of us to create the kind of educational system we want? So we know and we recognize that as equity leaders, uh, the system that we have is it's set up to produce what it's currently producing. We know that uh, through an equity lens, and I'm sorry because I'm having some tech issues over here on my end. So we recognize that a change is needed, and this change requires that we see the system and what the system is producing. It requires that we engage with others to design something different, something that again brings equity to the table as our front and center approach. We know that this requires that we act. So once we have a thorough understanding of what the system is, what the system's producing, we're engaging with all stakeholders, and we take every opportunity we have to act. So right now we have this rare opportunity ahead of us. We have this rare opportunity in front of us to, as equity leaders, reimagine education. And again, by making equity pauses throughout the processes that we're engaged with, we see the system with fresh eyes. So I'm going to ask you to please take a few moments to reflect on this critical quote, and you share with us in the chat box what is resonating with you. Now, I'm not sure about my audio because I'm getting a message that's making me nervous on this side. Dr. Castro, do we have anything in the chat box that you can share with us?
I don't see any responses in the chat box yet. Thank you. So absolutely, they're coming in now, right? A couple of them: engage, design, and act. A huge opportunity right now. We first have to see what the system is producing for change. Thank you. Opportunities. Be willing to take action. See what our system is producing. And thank you for this last one here. Are we willing to be a part of the change? Again, ample opportunities.
Great. Thank you, colleagues, for sharing with us. As we move on to the next slide. So again, it is time for us to reconsider the approach that we're taking to the LCAP design. We know that before COVID, there were needs that our English learners had. We know that some of those needs were masked and they were uncovered in the last year and a half as we've gone through these challenging times. So recognizing that there were needs before, there's been needs during COVID, and there's needs that will be passed this time. So again, it is critical that we bring that equity lens to our work and we start looking at how do we develop LCAPs that are not only comprehensive in nature, but that they're also visible. How do we inform our LCAP planning? How do we ensure that it's aligned to the EO roadmap policy, that aspirational policy that we know we're charged to enact in our systems? We need to make sure that our LCAPs become statements of intent and commitment and direction, that they become that guide that we utilize as stakeholders to follow those predetermined pathways to our equity systems wide work. So moving on to the next slide, it is more critical than ever, colleagues, that we again continue to apply that equity lens to all the processes we're engaged with, but particularly LCAP, being that that's the topic of our session today. So making sure that through this process and throughout the process, we continue to ask ourselves, how is equity being addressed? So as we engage with the various components of this LCAP, and we recognize that we'll need to be mindful of conductive extensive needs assessments, that we'll need to be mindful of how are we allocating our resources, ensuring that the data we're collecting is truly informing our goals, our actions, our strategies, and those measurable outcomes that will allow us to continue continue to inform our next steps. We need to ensure that we are bringing in every single stakeholder, representatives for every single stakeholder. So through their involvement, again, we continue to address equity. The National Equity Project invites us to take equity pauses, and this equity pauses, again, need to be taken throughout the process in very meaningful ways. The equity pauses that we take will allow us to notice and reflect on how our system is currently operating. It'll allow us, the equity pauses should allow us to figure out, so who is protected in the system and who are we harming, if anyone? It'll allow us to figure out through the stories we hear, through the data we collect, identify those inequities and figure out how can we end them? What is it that we might be able to do different as we're approaching our LCAP and any other process that impacts our children? So moving on to the next slide, we would like for us to take an equity pause and reflect on our role as equity leaders. In applying a lens to the work that we're doing, to this role that we're doing, we take a few moments to think about the following two questions. How might we use the COVID-19 learning and experiences to inform and support our core values, our vision, our goal areas? How might this new learning inform our context as we reimagine school system and student success? So let's take a few moments to reflect on these two prompts, and again, coming at the answers through our current roles and applying that equity lens. What are some of those opportunities that we see to inform our practice, to revisit our values, our vision, and those goal areas that we're calling out in the LCAP? And we ask you to please share in the chat box anything that's resonating with you, anything that you're considering. And Dr. Castro, I'll have you be my eyes as you take a look at the chat box. Thank you.
So Isela, I know that it is very important to provide a little bit of thinking time and taking this equity pause. But just again, just to reinforce, as we reflect on our role, whether we're an administrator today, a family member, a community member, a teacher, what we know that we have learned so much from this distance learning context, and we have grown in many ways. We have also uncovered many inequities, and in many ways, we are ready for this change in practice. What will that look like? Oftentimes I think about that courageous leadership, right? So we do invite you to share out. We are hoping that today's session is also collaborative through the chat, and is also an opportunity for you to share some ideas, some thoughts, and provide some of this collective we in moving our systems forward. So I do see, Isela, focus on vulnerable students, and a comment on, do we keep doing the same thing we have been doing? Inequity with internet accessibility was one thing that came out during the pandemic. Providing ELD instruction virtually was a challenge for some educators. Okay, thank you for your comments. A couple more. Continuing to engage our families in the decision-making process for supports and services for multilingual learners. And really switching to an assets-focused leadership for the strength that all cultures bring. We cannot disregard the inequities, but need to address them to support all of our students. And again, continuing to engage our families in the decision-making process. reimagine
Thank you.
school systems that focus on equity and access. And just the last one, Isela, if I may, how have we contributed to and engaged in the development our LEA's LCAP draft for this new year? Are we active participants? Very nice reflective question there.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. And colleagues, we would hope that you're noticing that we really want to make sure that we're thinking beyond the LCAP. So recognizing that the LCAP will be that pathway that would lead us to get our system in the next 3 years, recognizing that it's a 3-year plan, but being that pathway that will guide our work at all levels, in a pathway that is designed by listening to the voices of all stakeholders. So thank you for your input in the chat box. And as we move on to the next slide, again, continuing to remind ourselves that as equity leaders, we are being challenged to respond to times that are very difficult, not only for ourselves, but other stakeholders as well. So please take a moment to read the quote that we have on this particular slide. And as you read this quote, let's think about, are we sufficiently prepared to understand and respond to the challenging times in our role as equity leaders? And as you reflect on this, we do want to take a moment to share with you that we as MCAP feel that we are. Let's move on to the next slide. We feel that we are because we have extensive research that supports the work that needs to be done for English learners. We know that the research is there. We know that this research supports the best practices that we've been hearing about even before the pandemic as to the most effective ways to serve students who have been historically marginalized. So using that research and using the new learnings, the learnings that we've been able to identify in the last year and a half as we've been experiencing this pandemic. So taking the research, taking the new learnings to uncover, identify, ideate new possibilities that make our system a more equitable one that it's culturally and linguistically responsive to the many needs that our English learners bring to the tables, but then one that it's also willing to recognize the many assets that they bring as well, because there's so many assets that our English learners bring with them. So colleagues, we really want to encourage you to keep your eye on the research, to stay up to speed with the learnings we've done, and then the learnings that we'll continue to engage with as we continue to hear the voices of our users. And by putting those two elements together, that we uncover possibilities, that we ideate possibilities that again make our system a more equitable one. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Castro.
Thank you, Isela. Colleagues, one of the points that Isela brought out on this slide was really just honing in on that research. So by embracing that research, the new learnings, if we can move into the next slide, new learnings, that really just uncovered many opportunities of how can we reimagine education systems for our multilingual learners by exploring many of these possibilities and others that you are really exploring in your school systems. The MCAP Alliance has come together to develop an innovative tool that we believe will support in the design of your LCAP as you engage all of our stakeholders in this process. And if we can move to the next slide, please. On the next slide, you'll be able to see, I'm not sure if we're having some trouble with the slides. Thank you, thank you. So our collective MCAP vision and the energy of the MCAP leaders really helped produce this tool to help guide the LCAP work with a lens of equity for multilingual learners. We know that there was a need for additional actions and language. So the purpose of this document was really to provide sample action items for LEAs to then consider. And as you consider these, know that you can modify these, you can adapt these to your context in response to supporting English learners, to addressing their needs, to addressing the families, and supports in for English learners as they're in the structured English immersion in bilingual or dual language programs. You will see that in the organization of this tool, it is organized by the LCFF principles that are highlighted, aligned in each of the sections. And on the left side of the document, the organization, you'll see that it's aligned or there's correlation to the English Learner Roadmap policy and also the guiding principles for dual language learners. In the center, you'll see that we have provided the reflection questions. And those reflection questions are there for us to perhaps surface conversations around that principle. And these are by no means all inclusive and full complete, but these are a few reflection questions that we do encourage you to perhaps lift and be able to extend conversations in your settings as you're participating in the development of your LCAP with all of your stakeholders. As you also engage in this LCAP process with your educators at school sites, we also encourage you to think about some of these reflection questions in the lens of how do we continue to move programs forward for our students. Now, on the far right, you'll see that we also provided a few starting bullets. And there are, again, a few just starting bullets with sample language of action items and practices that we encourage you to perhaps continue to add, but you're welcome to lift from these bullets and add to your LCAP as you see necessary, depending on your system. We hope that this tool helps you as you look through each of the principles. In the next couple of slides, you'll learn a little bit more and we'll unpack one of the principles so that you can see how we lifted some of the language to address one of the needs that surfaced from a conversation with teachers. So Isela, I'll hand it back over to you so that you can take us through the creative tool that was developed.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. So colleagues, the intent of this next slide is to be able to build a bridge from the LCFF to the LCAP. And I would say that it's from the tool that we developed to any other aspect that you're hoping to refine of your program. And let me explain how. So you'll notice on this table that on the left-hand side, you'll find the LCFF priorities. And we know that we recognize that when it comes to the LCFF priorities, there's 10 that we address. Notice how on the left hand column, we're only reflecting 8 because priority 9 and 10 are specific to county offices. So when you're working on your LCAP, or again, when you're revisiting any planning or any of the processes that go back to the work that we're doing for English learners, you would begin with the priority that you're looking at. And then you would look across the table. So you'll notice that across the table, we've listed some of those key elements to highly effective instructional programs for students in general, not only English learners. And you'll see that each one of those key elements, it's a hyperlink to a page on the CDE website that will lead you to opening up a number of many other resources that are related to that key element or to those key elements. So when you're looking at using our tool, our hope is that you would look at it from 2 separate angles. Angle number 1 could be through the LCFF priority that you're addressing, or an angle number 2 could be through the key element that you're hoping to address, that you're targeting, and that you want to address through the LCAP design. And again, I would argue as an administrator that if I'm looking at ways to support my instructional program, enhance it or expand it, and let's say that I'm looking for tools and resources that would support with the work that I need to do for culture and climate, for example. I could go to this column, know very specifically which are the LCFF priorities that culture and climate ties to. And then again, by clicking on that hyperlink at the very top, I'd be able to access more tools and resources. And by more, I mean more than the one we're sharing with you today. It's tools and resources that have been created by CDE. So again, this would be a bridge between the LCFF and some of those key elements that we know we must address when designing or refining high quality instructional programs. So as we move on to the next slide, Dr. Castro will walk you through the tool and how to lift language from it to be able to utilize again in the design or the updating of your LCAP plan, as well as to inform any other processes that have to do with English learners and the variety of instructional contexts in which we would find them.
Thank you, Isela. I know that in the chat box, the link for the tool has been provided. So please feel free to open the tool so that you're able to follow along. So now let's begin to explore the tool, beginning with LCFF priority number 1. So as we start thinking of the LCAP process and we engage in this critical work, we recognize our role and responsibility as equity leaders. Our role really is to inform the process, to inform this process by that vision of the English Learner Roadmap policy and its principles. So as equity leaders, we must view the LCAP as that guide and that vehicle to align the resources and practices for implementing quality supports. You'll see that on this slide here, we see LCFF priority number 1, which addresses those basic services that fulfill those conditions for learning. And it attends to, as you can see, teachers that are assigned and credentialed to and fully credentialed, right? Students have access to the standards aligned instruction materials and resources. And this LCFF priority also attends to school facilities that are maintained in good repair. So when we look at the LCFF priority number 1, and Isela has just walked us through the previous document, which is making that bridge from the LCFF to the LCAP, some of the elements that we saw there were really looking at equity, professional learning, those resource alignments, the supports or the hiring practices for teachers, that curriculum that we have and the instructional practices, and building that culture and the climate at our schools. As we do this work and move into this work of addressing the basic services through the LCFF priority number 1, we must also identify the spaces where we can incorporate what we have learned from this distance learning context. So I'm going to walk you through, as you look on the next slide, I'm going to walk you through another, going back, a quick reminder, just a quick overview of the tool that you saw just a moment ago, highlighting the correlation on the left with the English Learner Roadmap policy and the guiding principles for dual language. We know the center is those reflection questions. And we know on the far right, we have the sample action items or action language that you can lift. So this tool really allows you to lift specific language. You're able to expand it or modify it to meet the needs or the goals of the vision of your school and focus some of those resources for multilingual learners. On this slide, you see that we have highlighted a section. And in that section, I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides that in using this tool for the LCAP, we would consider grounding our work through the not only the EL roadmap principles, but also the resources provided. So if you see, we've highlighted on the far right an action. And it's an action that we have determined that we would like to continue to develop as a goal for our LCAP. So on the next slide, you'll see how that language was lifted, establishing a community and When we look on the next slide, we're looking at the template. Our districts have received access to a template from the CDE that indicates where we can type in, identify what are those goals that we would like to focus on to build equitable systems. And what are those planned actions and services? And you'll see those two small arrows there that identify the goals and the actions. Again, this is from the CDE approved annual update template. And these are the areas that we believe are key for using this resource or the tool that we have provided today. You can lift the language from our MCAP tool to indicate the goals that are necessary for moving your district, your LEA forward, and also actions or services. So you'll see on the next slide, to be more specific, just to give a little bit more clarity. Let's say that in response to your LEA needs, you have developed a goal to adopt a new curriculum. And looking at that LCAP goal, we can identify that there have been some modifications. We lifted some of this language from the LCAP, the MCAP tool that was presented to you, and we did some modifications in the language to indicate our goal. We developed the time, and we said that by June 2021, the Curriculum Adoption Committee will advise the governing board on the new ELA or ELD curriculum adoption of a culturally and linguistically appropriate product that is responsive to our diverse student demographics. So you see that that was lifted directly from the MCAP tool with some modification. But you'll see that in the on this slide, on the action lifted from the MCAP tool, you'll see that if that is an action that you want to consider for your LEA, you'll see that the action is really to establish a committee that reviews those materials for English learners with a lens of alignment with the standards and the cultural relevance. So this tool is really there to provide you not only the reflection questions, but also providing you some of the language that you're able to use with modifications. For purposes of today's webinar, we have only provided a breakdown of LCFF priority number 1. But if you wish to continue the same process with your school site teams, you can do the same with LCFF priority number 2. And we invite you to do that. You can bring LCFF priority number 2. You could look at our resource and our tool and identify some of those reflection questions or action items that you believe you might want to consider for your system, and you're able to create that goal and then that action item as well. So as we move into the next section, we wanted to give you a little bit of time. I know that we've shared some resources and some information, but I'll go ahead and hand it over to Lisa now, who's going to share with us a bit of the reflection process.
Thank you, Dr. Castro. So now you've heard a little bit about the process, about the MCAP team and the purpose of this tool and how it aligns to the roadmap. And so we really thought this would be a perfect opportunity for us to just kind of be quiet and let you have that processing time to explore the tool and to really think about how you might be able to implement that in your context. So as you're viewing the tool, we have a few guiding questions that we'd like you to consider, because we'd like you to respond and give us some feedback on the Padlet after we take some time to explore. So as you're viewing, we just ask you to kind of consider these questions. What are you noticing? How might this tool support your LCAP development? How might this tool support other efforts as they relate to our English learners? And given your current practice, what sample actions might you be able to share or add today? So again, we just ask that you consider, as you're exploring these tools, a couple of these questions that you might want to respond to on our Padlet. And we're going to go ahead and provide that exploration time for you to really look at the tool. And again, the link to the Padlet is in the chat, and we invite you to click on the link and respond, and perhaps look at others who have responded to see their ideas. And we'll take just a couple more minutes to explore the tool.
Colleagues, I just wanted to reemphasize that as you're looking at our tool, you'll notice that we have probably between 5 to 6 sample action items per priority. The goal behind having only a few is to be able to lift from your practice, to lift from the field additional action items that, again, apply that equity lens to the work that we're all engaged with. So we truly do encourage you to please share with us any additional sample action items that you would like to see added to this tool. Again, we want this to be the work of a collective, and you are part of that collective. You can share those action items or any that you can think of right now, or as we end our session later on today, if you're willing and interested to come back to the Padlet and add to it, we're definitely going to be reviewing them and again adding them to this tool that we hope is statewide collective effort.
Again, thank you participants for adding to the Padlet. You've noticed that this is not all inclusive. We continue to build the resources and share it statewide so that across the state we can have we can share ideas on how to best support our multilingual learners through each of the LCFF priorities. So as we move, we appreciate you again adding to the Padlet and continuing to add and share it as well. As we move on to our presentation and to our next slide, we also want to share that as we think about and reflect a little bit about these opportunities, and I know earlier in the chat, we reflected a bit on seizing the opportunity and what this means. I saw some words that just resonated with me: leadership, courage, taking on the moment, designing, fresh eyes, reimagining, thriving environments. We know that if we take a moment, it's really time to develop these comprehensive plans that are informed by our leadership, by the words and the voices that we hear from our stakeholders, that are also aligned to some of our policies, like our English Learner Roadmap policy and the guiding principles for dual language learners. Our LEA's LCAP needs to become that statement of intent, truly just a commitment and a direction as we guide this work, and strategically think about what are those new or innovative ideas for reimagining thriving education systems that are equitable for all students. If we're looking at the resources and providing high quality materials, also those being purposeful with identifying those services or those programs, and really thinking about the whole system, thinking about the vision and the mission of the district, and also ensuring that you're creating those spaces to include all of the voices for from your stakeholder groups. And on this, we see that Dr. Lori Olson really invites us through her quote, is indicating this is our time. And I know that collectively, we will be able to continue to accelerate learning for our English learners across our state and create equitable systems for all of our students. So as we begin to wrap up today's webinar, we ask you to take a moment and reflect on the following questions that are on this slide, and think about how might you use this to perhaps to inform your current context and your next steps. Now, my colleague Isela Jacobo mentioned earlier in the presentation is not next steps with LCAP alone, but if we think of post LCAP, how might you use some of these reflection questions, perhaps some of these suggested action items to elevate or lift some of the conversations across your school systems. As equity leaders, we invite you to reflect on other opportunities where you can identify using some of these resources and supports for multilingual learners. Perhaps you might want to consider, as you're developing your SPSA for your school, if you're perhaps applying for grants that are for supporting multilingual learners. Maybe you're conducting your self-study and working on the WASC accreditation process. We're thinking that some of these questions and some reflection questions and perhaps some of those action items can help inform some of the work that you're also doing in the development or the revision of the annual English Learner Master Plan. So as you're designing your own actions and goals for your LCAP, we invite you to continue to access the Padlet and again, share some of the action items to create this collaborative space. We will be providing the Padlet, we'll be providing the slides for today so that you can continue to use these in your LEAs. I'm sure that you perhaps have already been engaged in the process with your LEAs. And in many cases, it's already prepared and going to for board approval. But we know that there are continuing conversations to be had about how do we continue to stimulate programs, services, and to identify those courageous spaces so that we can create equitable schools for our multilingual learners. We thank you, educators, for affirming the identity of our students and for creating those assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools for our multilingual learners. We know that at the core of our work is uncovering inequities, and we have an opportunity right now with fresh eyes to reimagine schools for our multilingual learners across the state. We thank you for joining us today in this webinar. We also invite you, as we move into our next slide, we invite you to reach out to us. You'll have access to our emails on the next slide. We're also on social media. And if you'd like to visit our webpage, we're at multilingualcalifornia.org. You can visit our webpage and subscribe. We're looking forward to continuing to plan for statewide professional learning in a virtual platform, looking at the fall of 2021. So stay tuned for perhaps leadership opportunities, educator opportunities that will be offered free through our collaboration with our 5 county offices of education. I also want to say thank you to our MCAP leads who have joined us today. And I know that today with us, we had representation from San Bernardino. We had representation from Butte, from Fresno, and from San Diego. And I know there are colleagues here from Orange County, our MCAP leads. So we want to say thank you for joining us and have a good afternoon. Thank you, colleagues, for this work. Thank you, Isela. Thank you, Lisa. And also thank you to our MCAP team for all of your support in providing behind the scenes. Alexandra, I think we can now stop recording. And I know the session will be ending. I know that there's another session coming on, but thank you, participants, for joining us here today. If you're still here, again, we invite you to visit our website at multilingualcalifornia.org.